going to be talking about Regtech. My name is Kieran Garvey. I work with the Cambridge Centre for Alternative Finance, which is based at the Business School in Cambridge. Thank you for those who continue to join from the previous session where we're looking at regulatory sandboxes. I think we'll kind of take a similar approach to what we're looking at here in this session. So I'll give you a very quick intro into what we're doing at the CCAF. Want to look at Regtech and Suptech, kind of look at some of the kind of definitions and some of the problems that a lot of these different issues and approaches are looking to address. Try to give you a framework for kind of conceptualizing different Regtech activities. Look at some of the use cases and functions, and I really want to invite your thoughts on what you would find the most interesting and useful in your organization. If you work in the private sector or if you work in regulators, what are your regulatory pain points? What do you wish technology could help you automate or do better? Where are your regulatory pain points? Also, just share a little bit on the recent report that we've done, looking at Regtech, so looking at the different technologies that are being employed in different Regtech applications, looking at the market data in different countries, also trying to look at who are the users of Regtech, why are they interested in these different products, what are they doing with it. And then I want to spend a decent amount of time looking at how regulators are using Regtech or Suptech and some of the kind of opportunities and challenges related to that, and then finish with a few different case studies and some lessons learned. So hopefully that will be useful for you and help to kind of demystify and make Regtech a little bit clearer as to what it is. So I did this in the session before. I know I can see a few familiar faces, but who of you are regulators and policymakers? Okay, fantastic. Okay, brilliant. Who of you are fintech firms? Okay, no fintech firms here. Banks or traditional financial service providers? Okay, brilliant. Researchers, academia? ADB people, ADBI? Fantastic, brilliant. Okay, great. So we've got a good mix of regulators and the private sector as well. And within the regulators, central banks, who works at a central bank? Yeah, and who works in kind of securities organisation or ministries of finance? Okay, fantastic, thank you. And who of you have been a user of a Regtech solution? Who has used Regtech? Okay, nobody. Who knows what Regtech is or thinks that they have a sense of what it is? Okay, fantastic, fantastic. Okay, could you just maybe give us, what are some words you would use to associate with Regtech? What does it mean to you? Please.
Yeah, my name is Witu, come from FSA, Indonesian FSA.
Thank you.
Yeah, of course, Regtech and Suptech is a new area right now, and right now, Osika have what call this consultant from US is Bill Gates and Melinda Foundation. Is yeah, right now it's still in the develop Regtech and Suptech, but in my opinion is actually we also already have a lot of digital supervision, digital report, obviously a lot of, but still in the lot of island IT, something like that. So, yeah. So the problem is how we have a kind of roadmap, a kind of how to integrate actually, how a lot of IT island actually in terms of and using the latest of IT framework. I think this that's why I follow this session. Thank you.
Fantastic. Thank you very much. So just talking about kind of different islands of technology that are maybe in the IT department, but how to kind of bring them into the rest of the organization through kind of, some people call it digital transformation, for example. Any other ideas what Regtech is? Maybe someone from the private sector? I don't know how, please.
Regtech basically looks like automatization process of the supervisory and regulatory process on the regulated firm side mostly, but also regulator side. This is called probably more Suptech, but technologies could be quite similar.
Fantastic, thank you. So just by automation of the compliance process for the private sector or for regulators, brilliant. In terms of kind of regulatory pain points, can anyone share what they see as a major problem in terms of regulation? If you work in a central bank or in a regulator, what do you see as a problem with regulation?
One of the main problems that I see is that regulation normally cannot catch up with the advancement in technology. So, for example, crowdfunding here in the Philippines was just recently the Securities and Exchange Commission has just recently enacted rules, whereas in other countries it's already a de facto standard, right? So sometimes they're not able to catch up.
Brilliant, thank you very much. So just kind of taking time to adapt to changes in the market. Any other kind of regulatory pain points that people want to share?
Data, complexity of regulation.
Second, crypto.
Complexity of regulation
Yeah.
and sheer amount of reporting.
Yeah, so complexity, just insane amounts of data or an insane amount of information that you have to process and try to make sense of. Wonderful, okay. So, as I mentioned, we're a research centre. We're based at the business school at the University of Cambridge. Basically, we try to collect data from the industry, the fintech industry, and also from regulators to understand what's happening in different countries all over the world in terms of what's happening on the market development side, but then also how regulators are responding to those market developments. So we publish lots of reports on different areas within, I don't know, crowdfunding as was mentioned, peer-to-peer lending, crypto assets, blockchain, kind of regulatory technology, regulation, and each year we're speaking to and working with and interviewing and collecting data from thousands of fintech firms all over the world to be able to kind of build relationships with these different firms that are changing very quickly, as I'm sure you are aware. We also work very closely with regulators, so over 110 regulators we recently surveyed with the World Bank to understand what they are doing in Regtech, for example, or regulatory sandboxes, or ICOs, or equity crowdfunding, to just try and get a kind of snapshot what's happening right now in the regulation of fintech. And every year we try and go back and say, okay, well, how's that changing? How's that changing? So we can kind of see how different regulators are responding to these market developments. So you can see all of our reports if you're interested on our website. And then kind of the most relevant report that we've recently studied for this session, obviously, is Regtech. So we've just recently published a study which was our first global Regtech benchmarking study, which was done over 2018, 2019. And really the purpose of this research was to try to categorize and see what is out there in the market. So we started with kind of a taxonomy. We looked at other people that have researched this area, and we tried to find some kind of common features of how people are looking at Regtech. And then we wanted to take that classification and then build our own kind of taxonomy and then look at what's happening in the industry, how it's growing, how it's evolving, what are the different activities of these different fintech firms, and try to understand some of the dynamics of how it's changing. So globally, we identified about 658 firms. We had about 111 that responded to our survey, and then we did lots of kind of interviews on top of that. And a lot of the kind of information that I'm covering today is from that report, so you can easily find it online. Okay, so thank you for kind of your thoughts on what defines Regtech. So here are kind of 4 different definitions. The first one looking from the FCA. So they look at this as a subtech subset of fintech, which focuses on technologies and the delivery of regulatory requirements more efficiently and effectively. So the use of technology to deliver regulatory requirements. ASIC, the Australian securities regulator, the use of technology, looking at regulatory requirements and compliance requirements more efficiently and effectively. So you can see it's all about technology, it's all about regulatory requirements and increasing efficiency and effectiveness. The FSI within the Bank for International Settlements, the applications of technology in relation to compliance with regulatory and reporting requirements. And then finally, Accenture, the professional services firm, innovative applications of technologies to change to compliance requirements to efficiently mitigate risk. So the definition that we've used is any use of technology to match structured and unstructured data to information taxonomies or decision rules that are meaningful to both firms and the regulators to automate compliance or oversight. So really about the use of data, the automation of that, and how that maps to what is meaningful to a business and also meaningful to a regulator, and how that information can then be integrated. So we see kind of three kind of broad types of Regtech. So firstly is for the private sector, to help firms be able to meet their regulatory obligations. But then also on the other side to help regulators, to help them supervise, to help them monitor the market and what's happening out there. And the third one is really to change the regulatory process and change the regulatory system. So how can traditional legislation or regulation, how can technology be applied to that in order to, for example, make it machine readable or machine executable, which is something that's been discussed recently as something to be focusing on within Regtech. And also within the CCAF, we are developing a system to try and help regulators to see the differences between regulation in different countries. So using technology to be able to gather all the regulation from different countries and to organize it into basically comparable frameworks and do that automatically. So why is Regtech something to be interested in or talking about? So I guess, as I think was mentioned, just the pace of change. After the global financial crisis, the number of updates and amendments to regulation have really increased massively. So in 2017, there were over 56,000 regulatory updates in 2017 alone. In 2008, there was only 8,700. So within a decade, you're talking about masses of change and regulation, which is really expensive and difficult for regulators to keep up with, but then also, of course, the firms that are regulated. Another key issue is there's a growing rise in kind of the responsibility of senior management and their accountability. And therefore, they want to have access to information more readily so that they can make sure they're able to do their jobs more effectively. And given the amount of data that is being created by these new firms, that is becoming more and more difficult to address. And technology is needed to help make sense of the masses of new information that is being created. Just as an example, so between 2017 to 2018, a tier 1 bank to build a single integrated data lake across all of its bank's operations would take around 10 petabytes of data, which apparently is the same amount of data as would have been needed to archive the whole Wayback Machine. So I don't know if you've ever heard of the Wayback Machine. It's a really interesting website that basically archives the whole internet, or much of the internet. So all of the data that was available on the internet, a couple of years later, one bank has that amount of information. So it's a phenomenal amount of new data that is being created. In the previous session today, we can kind of understand why that's happening. So the price of storage of data is just falling massively. The price of exchange is falling, data exchange, so bandwidth is falling massively. CPU processing power, so computer processing power, the price of that is falling massively. But then also you have millions, billions of new devices that are connected to the internet, and that is increasing massively. So your phones, your electronic equipment, and soon basically all of your wearable devices, etc., etc. There's going to be lots and lots of devices that are connected to the internet that are creating lots and lots of new data. So in all industries, but of course in finance and as regulators, you have more and more data that you have to deal with and make sense of. And that is extremely challenging. And it's a problem that every industry is trying to deal with, but obviously for you as financial regulators and in the private sector is definitely an issue of concern. And also I suppose it's worth raising the point that a lot of this data is unstructured, as in it doesn't follow a normal path. For example, in social media, for example, there's so much information about people's perceptions that is very important to help inform, for example, if a particular product is causing harm in the market. But how do you process that information to be able to understand if that is really a problem or it's not? That information is really important to help regulators kind of decide whether or not there is an issue that requires action. But in order to take that information, structure it and make sense of it is a really, really difficult task. This just kind of highlights the kind of regulatory updates that you can see. So this is regulatory change globally. You can see around 2008, which was the financial crisis. After that, masses of new regulation that's coming into force. Also, as well, you can see with these blue dots here, increasing fines as well that are issued by regulators, which is really driving an incentive for firms to make sure they're complying with regulation properly or risk being fined. So for the private sector, Regtech and solving that problem is becoming a really important issue. And just to kind of put a total figure in it, I'm not sure, I haven't looked into the detail of this number, but apparently, globally, the differences in financial regulations between different countries in terms of the compliance officers that you have to hold, in terms of the legal advice, in terms of the time and effort and energy that you have to have as a financial service provider, as well as the regulators, the resources needed to do this, cost around $780 billion a year. And given the increasing complexity, that is going to become a bigger problem. So I mean, does this, as the regulators here, do you agree with this kind of analysis? Is that the same in your markets? Do you see more regulation coming? No? In the private sector, I saw some people working in kind of financial services. Do you see kind of increasing levels of complexity and regulation, or to an extent? Okay, so that's kind of the background problem to help frame the kind of issue of Regtech. So kind of 4 questions that maybe help to kind of think through the different types of Regtech out there, because Regtech covers a whole kind of spectrum of different activities. So who is the user? So is it for the banks or traditional financial service providers? Is it for fintechs? Is it for regulators or policymakers? Maybe it's even for consumers in terms of helping them, for example, verify their identity if they want to access a particular product or service. So who is the user? What is the objectives of the kind of Regtech solution in terms of maybe where it fits in the compliance process? And we'll come back to this in just in a second. Thirdly is kind of how does the Regtech solution work? What types of technology is it using? Maybe what's its business model, for example? What's its approach to delivering its solution? And finally is what type of kind of regulatory requirements are the solutions built for? So we can look at that. We've got some data just to show of the kind of Regtech firms that we have surveyed, what areas of regulation are they focused on? So I don't know if you've ever seen CB Insights, but they always do these nice kind of infographics, kind of mapping out what's happening in different industries, which I think is useful. It kind of shows some of the different examples of firms. So if you're interested, just go into CB Insights and then type Regtech, and you can then see some of the different firms in the different areas. So in, I don't know, in tax management or reporting or environmental health, safety and quality, information security. So it's kind of a useful way to see some of the firms that are operating in these different sectors, but kind of conceptually it doesn't really help you understand what they do and what but it's still useful if you want to learn about the industry. So here are some of the kind of key segments that we started looking at when we were thinking about Regtech and looking into this research. And then going through the process of kind of speaking to a lot of these firms and understanding exactly how they operate, we evolved into kind of this type of segmentation. So I'll try and walk you through this. And then it'd be great for you to kind of think where your organization, maybe kind of what are you focusing on at the moment, which aspect. So you as an organization, you generate data, and some of that data will come from outside your organization. If you're a regulator, if you're in the private sector, you're going to be generating data from outside, but also internally as well. So you're going to be receiving calls, you're going to be receiving messages or emails or whatever it may be. You're going to have people speaking on the phone, and that's all kind of generating data that might be relevant to something, it might not be. Also, of course, kind of transactions. So if you're a financial service provider, probably the type of thing you're doing is generating information about different transactions in relation to different services. And that ultimately feeds into creating content. And some of that content is going to be relevant for regulators to try to understand. And so this is quite unstructured data that, as I say, might be relevant or might not be. And traditionally, the process of kind of extracting the meaning of that was very manual, and it took a lot of time, it took a lot of people. So this process has been going on, this data generation and bringing all that content together, that's been happening for a long time. Then you have this data that needs to be kind of processed either manually or via Regtech solutions in an automated way. And that information's got to be kind of mapped to the different functions of the business. If you're a bank, what does that data mean to you and why? If you're a regulator, you're going to have a different perspective of what data is important and why. And you will, as a firm, kind of map that to your policies and controls maybe in relation to different areas. Similarly with the regulator, different parts of the information might be relevant for different departments in your business. It might help to generate a profile of one of your users or your customers, for example. It might help to inform a risk register to identify particular kind of problems or concerns within the organization or relate to counterparties. So this first kind of phase is the collection and creation of data and then putting that together. And then it's a case of analyzing that data and then see where that fits in relation to your organization. And then finally, the third phase is really about, why does this matter? How does this map to giving the senior management within my organization the tools and information they need to make sense of this, to be able to take decisions? And that's in the private sector. And for regulators, rather than the kind of oversight and governance of a private sector firm, it would be the regulators. They need the information in a format that they can understand to be able to make sense of this. And so I suppose the data goes from being quite unstructured to trying to make sense of it, to make it more structured, and then by the end of it, hopefully it's organized in a consistent way that you can make sense of it. And as I say, this whole process is manually done normally, but there is an opportunity for each of these arrows, basically, is a potential Regtech use case. So it's an opportunity for technology to make that process more efficient so that it doesn't rely on manual people doing it, which can take a lot of time and effort, whether or not that's in the private sector or for regulators. So I'd like to maybe just take a few minutes to kind of maybe discuss amongst yourself about where you see in your organisation you are in terms of trying to map or automate any of these processes. Is that something that your organisation as a regulator maybe, is that something you're looking at? Is it about taking your voice generated data? So for example, I know the Australian regulators, they've been spending a lot of time looking at voice calls from insurance and being able to try to analyse that information to see basically has there been mis-selling, for example, or any types of issues relating to kind of consumer conduct. In terms of kind of mapping unstructured information to any of your kind of processes or obligations. So yeah, could you maybe just take a couple of minutes and see if you can think